Thank you, Deborah. I always love this conference because it feels like a big family reunion. And so I am so excited to be here today, but even more exciting to introduce our keynote, Dr. Deborah Leong, or Debbie, as she likes to be called. And I first heard of her, or knew of her, when I read her book, Tools of the Mind, which, if you have not read it, it's really incredible. And as I got to the end of the book, there is this whole section on that endorses the work of Magda Gerber and Dr. Pickler and ties it to the Vygotsky. And then I became very interested. And because I'm a part of the programs for infants and toddlers, I also got to hear her speak at one of our advanced trainings where they bring in researchers to share their work. And it was really exciting to hear what is close to my heart is that play is so important, not only for children, but for all of us. And so Deborah and her colleagues have a program located in the Denver areas, which is Tools of the Mind, and it takes, and then I've spent lots of time on the telephone with her, and so we have become great friends, and I am so pleased to introduce Dr. Deborah Leong.
Good morning. I want to thank Polly for all the time that she spent with me on the phone discussing what I was going to talk about today. So today I'm going to cover what is self-regulation and executive function, why mature intentional play is important to self-regulation and executive function, and how does mature intentional play develop, and what you do to nurture this in infants and toddlers. So, self-regulation is the term that's used by us in education or in psychology to describe pretty much what neuroscientists call executive function. And it's related to the development of the prefrontal cortex, which is this area in front of your head. And it's a core process that affects both cognition and emotion. So it's not just emotional development, it's not just cognitive development. And I also wanted to say something about what self-regulation is. So I want you to notice the self in self-regulation. It's not the same thing as obedience. So while obedience is important, because children, can endanger themselves and you want them to follow directions, it is not enough, because what we want to develop is a society where children are self-regulated, which means self-accepted rules. So they're following because it's inside them, they know what's right. So we work primarily with preschool and elementary school teachers, and I'll go in and the teacher will say, my children are self-regulated. But what you see is really they're afraid of the teacher. And so what we have is what we call the substitute teacher test. If you leave the room and your children are naughty, then they're not self-regulated. They're regulated by you. And so Vygotskians, we call that other regulation. So it's not that that's not important, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the process of how it goes inside you and becomes self-regulation. So this is just to remind you what the brain looks like. So this area that's all colored, the prefrontal cortex, is where the area of the brain that houses this. And self-regulation and executive function skills build through childhood and adolescence. And I used to cut this off at about 30, and everyone got nervous because it's starting to go down. So I wanted to make sure you all realize that actually we still have it as we get older. It is a little lower, though, as we get older. As my mother-in-law says, sometimes I say things and I didn't really mean to. It just pops out of my mouth. All right, so one way to think about this process is to think of it as the traffic controller of the mind. So this is the mind, this is the part of your mind that directs your mental actions in an intentional way. So if you didn't have self-regulation, you would just react to situations instead of thinking first and acting, or planning and acting. So the thing about self-regulation is it buys you self-reflection and time to think. So these are the three components of executive function self-regulation. It's inhibitory or effortful self-control, working memory, and cognitive flexibility. I'm going to go through each of these. So inhibitory or effortful self-control is defined as your ability to stop a response that's dominant or habitual, and instead allow a subdominant response to come forward. So it's being able to act appropriately when you don't feel like it, right? So I'm sure you guys have never had a situation like this where you take a child to a grocery store and they have a meltdown on you because they want to stay in the candy aisle. So it's this ability to, the child still wants candy, right? But what the child does to get past the candy aisle is to hold that in abeyance. So the reaction is to want, to grab, and the self-regulation part is stepping back and saying, she's not going to buy me candy. It involves the ability to delay gratification. Inhibitory control also involves paying attention despite distractions. So in infants, the birth of this is just the beginning when they adapt arousal cycles in response to, so that they can quiet themselves, things like that, physiological things. And when they begin to focus on expressions and specific expressions from parents to react to them or caregivers, and the beginning of anticipatory attention, which means looking for something that they know is going to happen. It's the beginning of it. 8 to 10 months, it's being able to have a task where you have two actions that you put together, and again, anticipatory attention at this age predicts executive function at 3 and 4 years of age. At 9 to 11 months, it's the ability to inhibit one action. So you're holding, what they do is they put the child, and there's a barrier between the child and this toy that they want, and it's the child's ability to stop themselves from trying to grab when they know it won't work, but to think about another way around. And at 4 and 5 years of age, it's reductions in perseveration, which means doing something over and over again, even if it doesn't going to work. And being able to delay gratification, being able to hold an arbitrary rule in your mind and follow it. So for adults, and this adult level is reached at about 7, 8, it's being able to ignore irrelevant information, like when you're reading and you don't look at the picture, but you look at the text, for example. Controlling anxiety when you make mistakes. It involves controlling your temper when you don't get what you want, and being able to stop and think before you act. So Vygotsky, who is the theorist that we follow, says that children act first, think later, and gradually in elementary school, they move to thinking first, acting later. Okay, so the second piece is working memory. So that's the ability to hold information in your mind and work on it. So it's being able to hold two things in your mind, and it is usually the thing that really makes schooling difficult for some children, is the size of this working memory, and it grows over time. So at 7 to 9 months, you start seeing it when children remember the old Piagetian object permanence kinds of tests. They remember that there is something underneath the blanket. So, and putting two actions together in sequence. At 9 to 10, it's means, ends, actions, two-step actions, also being able to integrate looking in one place and searching in another. So that's when they move the object from one blanket to the other, and the child actually figures out it's in the last blanket, not the first one. At 3 years, it means holding two rules in mind, like red goes here and blue goes there, and acting on that fact. And at 4, it's being able to hold another person's perspective in mind and your own. So when you think about it, the act of sharing involves memory, right? Because you have to remember what that other person's doing and how that relates to you. And we think of sharing sometimes as an emotional kind of thing for kids, but actually there's a cognitive piece to it. So for an adult, this means thinking about information and being able to work it on the same time, being able to reflect. You know how in kindergarten, you usually ask children, how did you get that answer? And they go, I don't know, it just came to me. So this is the fact that they can't think and then think about what they're thinking about at the same time. So you see that in 8-year-olds can tell you how they solved the problem, what they were thinking at the time. And I said thinking about more perspectives at one time. So cognitive flexibility is the last piece of self-regulation, and it's the one that takes longer to develop. And so this means being able to change and adjust your mental effort. So in little kids, what you see is their ability to switch strategies when one doesn't work. So it's really a matter of switching. That's the piece that's the cognitive regulation, cognitive flexibility. At 4 and 5, they succeed in shifting actions and changing rules. So this is a test where children are asked to sort first by color, and then they're asked to sort by trucks or stars. And without cognitive flexibility, they can't make themselves do the second sort. They can only sort the first way by color, and they can't sort by picture. So for adults, this is the multitasking myth. It's our ability we feel like we're doing 2 things at the same time, but in reality, we're doing them in sequence. So cognitive flexibility is switching back and forth between tasks, and we do it so quickly it feels like it's multitasking, doing 2 things at the same time. It's investing more mental effort in a task that's difficult. So when you know something's hard, your mind focuses in. You know you should be paying attention, and flexibly changing levels of attention as a task changes. So the reason executive function is important is you need it not when you're doing something that's habitual. You need it when you're trying to do something new. So when you're learning that A, the letter A, says A sometimes, but also has an sound, learning that second sound, you have to have executive function or you'll still keep saying it's A. So a lot of the reason you have repetitive errors is because you can't stop the habit. Does that make sense? Okay, so when you think about something that you've learned, what I'd like you to do is we're going to do something we do, it's a Vygotskian teaching technique, which is that the idea that talking about something helps you clarify for yourself what the meaning of those things are. So I want you to turn to the person next to you and talk about this, and I'll give you about 2 minutes, and then I'm going to ring a chime and bring us all back together again. So tell the person a situation where you as an adult use self-regulation skills. So what I'm going to do next is you're going to take a self-regulation test. So this was a test that was developed by Adele Diamond, who is distinguished professor and the founder of cognitive developmental neuroscience. And this is something called a Stroop test. So what you're going to be presented with is a screen that has, we're going to do 2 different conditions. In the first condition, you press, it's called congruent. So you press on the side that you see the picture. And incongruent, you press on the opposite side that you see the picture. All right? So this is what it looks like when children take this test. So this is part of a study that was done that was written up in Science about our program, and it was the thing that made our program famous in the world. And so it requires holding 2 ideas in mind. So you can see how it's inhibitory control, but you also have to have working memory to do it. So this was a study. Our children performed 3 times better than a control group after having our program. And so in our program, we stress the development of self-regulation. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about why self-regulation matters, and then we'll talk about infants and toddlers and play itself. So it matters because actually executive function levels predict school achievement better than IQ and better than parent social class. So it trumps. So an at-risk child who has self-regulation will do as well as any child. And so we've been, stressing content the last 6 years since No Child Left Behind. The idea that if you knew your letters and numbers and you knew all these facts, that would be enough. And what we know now is that actually executive function is the skill that determines how quickly you learn new things. It affects peer relationships. I mean, who wants to play with somebody who blows up at you all the time, right? So it affects long-term and short-term, whether or not relationships, whether a child's aggressive, because for us, aggression is really a child thinking after they grab something. So in preschool, a lot of times, and even toddlers, they know not to grab, but at the moment of decision, they can't stop themselves. So it's this process of learning how to stop yourself from doing the habitual thing, which is to grab something or push someone over. That's the process of emotion regulation. We know that emotion regulation, it affects how much teachers interact with children, because they found that teachers avoid children that are unregulated. You actually don't interact with them very much. It also affects the child's ability to control stress and anxiety when they're learning. And it affects something called toxic stress. Toxic stress is this idea that children who grow up in families where it's very unpredictable and parents are really upset and there's this very negative emotional climate, a lot of times very weak attachment, they found that actually those children don't do well in school, and their learning, the neural connections that they make as they learn, are not as deep. And so a lot of researchers believe this is the reason we have 25% summer loss for many at-risk children. So you get them so far at the end of school, and you start the next school year, and it's like they haven't been in school. And it's because the neural connections are weaker. So actually, we're part of this study that's looking at toxic stress, because the researchers believe that if children can figure out a way to control their emotional levels in a classroom to make them more reasonable, then they'd be able to learn better. And what happens if children don't develop self-regulation? They're at risk for academic problems, antisocial behavior. When it is a big problem in daycare and preschools, there are studies that show that aggression and oppositional behavior has been found in a third of the class. 1 out of every 40 preschool children is expelled from preschool because of behavioral problems. And that is equal almost to elementary, junior high, and high school combined. So preschool children are being thrown out at that rate, bigger than all the rest of the children who are having difficulty in school. And then the last thing is that, for many children, attention deficit disorder is being overdiagnosed. And the children really aren't a true ADHD, but they just have no self-regulation at all. One of the things that we believe is that self-regulation is actually less now than it was in the past. And it's a byproduct of childhood. It used to be a byproduct of childhood, but it really isn't anymore. And why is that? Well, first of all, as families are so busy, they put less self-regulatory demands on children than we used to. It's like there was a study that was done that showed that it's like 3/4 of toddlers actually sit when they eat. 1/4 of them are allowed to walk around the house and eat at the same time. So the demands for self-regulation are really different. So most of us, right, could you leave the table when you felt like it? We had to wait. One of my sisters did not like vegetables, and I can remember sitting down and looking at the vegetables and thinking to myself, we're never going to get up. I'm going to be here till I'm 23 years old because she will not eat that, and we have to wait for her. Playtime has changed, right? So what did you guys do after school? First of all, you played probably and did not do hours and hours of homework. Played outside in your neighborhood. Your parents opened the door and they threw you out, right? In the summer, right? They locked the screen door. My mother would lock the screen door. You had to beg to come in to go to the bathroom. But today, children spend a lot of time indoors, right? They're watching video games. Younger and younger children are playing video games, watch a lot of television. We were just talking about the baby Einstein issues and stuff like that. A lot of screen time at a very early age. Another thing is that toys have changed, right? So toys used to be something that you interacted with other children. And now toys are, I was sitting next to a little kid. She must have been under 2 and she was playing with an iPad. Her own iPad, the mother said to me very proudly. Also, there are all these toys that are totally interactive. So this is Elaine and my nominee for the worst toy of, I think it was 2009. All of these condiments talk to each other. And the hamburgers also talk to them, as does the grill. So you can play and not ever say anything yourself because they talk to each other. They don't even need you. And even games have changed, right? Before, children used to make their own rules for games. Is that how most of us played? But now it's organized sports. And it's not to say organized sports are bad, but what that denies children is making up the rules themselves and learning how to solve issues on the playground and in the school. So again, what I'd like you to do is turn to the person next to you and think about self-regulation today. And do you think it's different? And what's the reason that you think is the cause of the difference? And so I'm not making a plea to go back, because we really can't. But the idea that the centers that you work in are a place where you can develop the kinds of things that will help children develop self-regulation and it's one of the few places where children can really still play, because parents are very, very busy. When they come home, it's very, the television is really a babysitter, right? It's not, if they had the time, they would play with them, but they're just really, really busy. We have to find ways to help them recapture the moments where they can have important interactions, because self-regulation is taught. It's not something that will develop on its own without support. Just like babies, are pre-wired to talk. If nobody's talking to them, they're not going to start talking. So it's our responsive stimulation on the other side that will produce the self-regulation. So just by way of introduction to Vygotsky, Vygotsky lived from 1896 to 1934. He was born 1 month after Piaget, but he died when he was 37. And he worked in high schools and colleges. He worked with special ed children. He believed that self-regulation is at the core of human activity, but he believed that self-regulation is something that's learned. So it's learned in responsive interaction with the environment, but it's learned. It's not something that just develops on its own. And he believed that the activity that produces the best self-regulation is intentional make-believe play. So it's not that we don't recognize that there's lots of different ways to play. You can explore things, you can play with objects. But for Vygotskians, make-believe play has a very specific set of characteristics. And it occurs in preschool. So I'm giving you this this is the upper end, and then we'll talk about how we work up into that. So mature make-believe play has roles with rules. And some of you have toddlers that can actually do this already. Roles with rules, and they use role speech. So they always play somebody. They're playing being mommy, daddy, the grocery store man, or whatever. And they have what's called role speech. That means they talk or attempt to talk like that person. And the reason roles with rules and role speech are so important is those provide the boundaries for the child's actions. And in this kind of role, children will stay with the role and not do something else because they know that that's in the role. So when my son was at the college daycare center, and so I could watch him through a one-way mirror when he was 2 and a half. He just started preschool. I heard his voice and talking to these girls, and I rounded the corner, and there he was. He was in a shopping cart, and this young lady behind the shopping cart, this mother, she had a hat on and high heels and a necklace, and the other little girl had a purse and gloves and everything, and they were holding him in the shopping cart. And he was saying, I don't want to be your baby. I want to do something else. And the two girls looked at each other and they said to him, you're the baby. You can just say wah. That's it. So he goes, wah, 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 wah. And they said, you know, he's a baby. We can't understand a thing he's saying. And they just kept going. But it's this whole thing, like he realized that, you know, he had to conform to the role. So the role and the rules are very, very important. The rules are implicit, which means you know the rule exists when they violate it. And it's the first time children voluntarily self-regulate because it's a choice to engage in the play and to stay in the play. In mature make-believe play, the scenario changes, and these changes are discussed in advance. So your baby's going to be sick, and you're going to do this, and I'm the doctor, I'm going to say that. And then they do it. They go, okay, now the baby's going to have a broken leg, and now we're going to do. So it's these planned scenarios that are then acted out. They have symbolic props, which means they can use anything to stand for anything else. This is the piece that's really missing. You know, when children have to have now, they have these toys that are so specific, they have to have that thing. So my niece came to visit us, and she was like about 4, and she had this Barbie doll. So I said, okay, let's play school with Barbie. And she goes, no, if we want to play school, we have to go down to Target and buy Barbie the school teacher, because this is Ariel Barbie, and she's a mermaid, so all she can do is swim. But it's this narrowness of the toys that children have now. They're so specific. Symbolic props, and then the last thing is deep engagement. In mature make-believe play, children can stay in the role for 40 minutes. I mean, think about yourselves. Didn't you, in the summer, you played the same roles over, day by day, over and over again? And this deep engagement in the role is really, really important. So in our classrooms, we really work with children to stay in the play. So I walked into this one classroom, and this little boy greeted me at the door, and he said, welcome to Home Depot. You can do it. We can help. So obviously they had been to Home Depot. So they set the classroom up like a Home Depot, and he goes, so what are you renovating today? So I said, my shoe, you know, being the tricky faculty member trying to test the child, and he rolled his eyes, and he said, it has to be in your house, you dummy. And so I said, okay, my kitchen. He goes, great, here's Bob, your design consultant. Bob is this big. He has a big red crayon. He goes, where do you want your refrigerator? And he can hardly say that word. But so after I planned my refrigerator, he said, you need, my kitchen, he said, you need to go to plumbing. And actually, they had all the Kohler things up, and the kids knew this is a kitchen sink, and this is the one for your bathroom. I mean, it's incredible what play can do and how they can recreate. But you notice what are they recreating? They're recreating the people around them, you know, not the things. The things are a prop on the way to the people. For Vygotskians, play can stand for many different kinds of things, but what's important is that it's this intentional make-believe play that causes the development of self-regulation. For Vygotskians, how does this play develop? So it starts in infancy with emotional communication. And you know, you all do this. You talk to parents about face-to-face interaction that's responsive. Sometimes you lead, but a lot of times you follow. You're looking at the child's face. It's anticipatory of what the child is looking at and thinking about. So you're thinking about what the child is thinking about. And it involves language, talking. So for Vygotskians, emotional communication builds more than just attachment, but actually builds access to learning. Because for Vygotskians, all learning is social. It always involves the mind of another person, all learning. And it's something that as we go up through the years in schooling, we kind of forget that because you're always telling children not to talk to each other and not to copy. But actually learning is very social. And it always involves some kind of communication through language, either gestural or oral speech. And so one of the big problems with this is who is the child communicating with? right? So you see parents, I've seen parents do this where they plop them in front and they have a TV going on the side. So what is really important is to actually explain to parents that this interactive piece is the beginning of play. That's the foundation of play, because it provides practice in going back and forth and exchanging with someone else. Because when you play, you just don't play being the receptionist and you don't have any customers. You can only play in reaction to someone else. So it's learning the joy of that interaction, the joyfulness of going back and forth. The child learns to track and notice what the other person is thinking about by looking at the parent's facial expressions and things like that. And it creates in the child this desire for connection. And it isn't an accident, I think, that the first people children play are their parents, right? Mommy and daddy, or sister and brother. People that are really important to them form the very first layer of play. So all the things that you do when you're explaining to parents about how to establish this relationship, you are laying the foundation for the play that is to come. In toddlers, what happens is the emergence of private speech and make-believe play starts in toddlerhood. So private speech is what Vygotskins call self-directed speech, so it's really directed to you yourself. You're really kind of talking to yourself, although it is moderately communicative. And it's usually serving a self-regulatory function. So have you ever seen children who are about to do something they shouldn't and they say no? Yeah, that's private speech. And you want to encourage children to use private speech and to say back, for example, if you ask them to sit down, you want them to say, so what are you going to do? I'm going to sit down. Because that speech becomes what is the foundation of self-regulation. And also in play, when they plan it out together, they're really engaging in moderately private speech with each other. So a famous set of experiments were done with toddlers at 24 months, where they were asked to put different colored checkers on a checkerboard. And they were asked to put the white checker on the black square and the black checker on the white square. And they found if they told the child to pick up the white square and say black, the child could do it. If you don't give them any direction, they become sidetracked by the color and they match it. Does that make sense? So this private speech directs them to put the object on the right spot. And a lot of times we don't allow children to say back the directions to things because we're busy and you don't realize the value of doing that. So what we do in our program, we have children say to each other what they're going to do. So 2.5-year-olds can say, so you say, what are we going to do next? We're going to, go on the rug and sit. And they can tell each other, and that will help them remember the directions. Or if you want them to remember a fact, they need to say it aloud so that they will remember. So private speech is very important, and it is developing the most between 2, right, when they're starting to really take off in their speech. And for some children, it's earlier, right, because language develops at different rates with different children. But you notice that once they start to get this speech, then they begin the road towards self-regulation. And a lot of little kids don't use their private speech at all. So private speech in play, children are usually describing their actions, like eat or hear or something like that when they're feeding a baby, a toy baby. So this paves the way for the beginning of make-believe play, the kind of make-believe play that causes self-regulation. So they begin to use symbolic substitutions that mimic real actions in a pretend way. So they feed a toy instead of themselves, or they pretend to feed themselves, but they're not really eating. That's all pretend, this pretense thing, and the use of symbolic substitutions. And so what we encourage parents to do with their young preschoolers and toddlers is to interact with them. So one of the things that we find in toddler classrooms, and we've only worked with very few really, but in preschool classrooms of 3-year-olds is that the teacher has to be the play mentor. Set up the scenario, kind of model. You see how she'd modeled things to do? You can pour the tea, they drink the tea, that kind of thing. You want to label the child's actions. Oh, he's thirsty, she's thirsty. You want to give him tea, that kind of thing, and encourage, build the scenario. So she said she's thirsty, she needs some more. So you have to act as the play mentor because this make-believe play is like a step above in complication from just exploring things. Does that make sense? So it's starting to develop the role being in the role. So the play mentor, because this mature level of make-believe play requires interacting with someone else, you really can't, some children do develop it on their own, but most children learn it in interaction with someone else. And all of us learned it because there were play mentors in our neighborhood. So our parents never had to do this because we had somebody else in the neighborhood who told you what to do and showed you how to play those things. And kids nowadays have some of them have very small families, so there are no play mentors. The best play mentor in the world is a 6-year-old and a 7-year-old. They're really wonderful. They'll tell